Welcome to Brookings. Thank you for joining us. I'm Martin Indyk, the Director of the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. And today we are launching a new collaborative effort by 25 of our fellows and senior fellows in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings called Big Bets, Black Swans, a Presidential Briefing Book. As you're all aware, on Monday, President Obama will be sworn in, and thereby he will become yet again a historic figure, both the first and second African-American president in the history of the United States. We think that he has an historic opportunity in his next 4 years to shape the emerging global order in a way that can extend and solidify the liberal international economic and political order that the United States has promoted and benefited from since the Second World War. The ways in which he can do this are outlined in our Big Bets, Black Swans memos, each of them a memo to the President by one or other scholar in the program in his or her area of expertise. We divided it up into those places where we think that the President, if he invests his time, energy, and the prestige of his high office, can have a transformational effect on the emerging global order. But then we outlined a number, some 9 black swans, those low probability but high impact kinds of events that, if they occur, can trip him up, divert the attention of his administration, and come to dominate his foreign policy agenda. And therefore, we outline the things that he and his administration will need to do to lower the probability further that these kinds of black swan events can take place. To discuss these events, we've selected these memos, I should say. We've selected a number of the scholars. We couldn't put all of them on to discuss this. We're going to have the first panel discussing the big bets, those transformational initiatives that we think President Obama should take. We're delighted again to welcome David Gregory back to the anchor's chair here at Brookings. David, of course, is the anchor of Meet the Press. And in the first panel, we're going to have, and I will introduce them quickly, a group of 5 of our scholar experts. Charles Ebinger, who wrote the Energy and Climate memo, together with Kevin Massey. His latest book is Energy and Security in South Asia. He heads up our Energy Security Initiative. Bob Kagan, who co-authored with me the memo on Plastic Moment. He is a senior fellow in the Center on US and Europe. And of course, his most recent book is the bestseller, The World America Made. Ken Lieberthal, who's just stepped down as director of the John L. Thornton China Center, and is now a senior fellow in that center. His recent book, Bending History, Barack Obama's Foreign Policy, was one that he wrote with Mike O'Hanlon and myself. Suzanne Maloney is a senior fellow in the Saban Center for Middle East Policy. She wrote the memo on turning Tehran, and her latest publication was Iran's Long Reach. Iran is a pivotal state in the Muslim world. Mireya Solis is the Knight Chair in Japan Policy Studies in the Center for Northeast Asian Policy Studies, CNAPS, and her most recent piece is on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, something that she wrote the Big Bet memo about. First of all, I want to express my appreciation to Tanvi Madan and Thomas Wright, two fellows in the foreign policy program who worked with me on this project and did much of the editing of the memos, and also Gail Chaliff and her very capable team for all the digital aspects of this. We are webcasting, and for those of you who are following the webcast or tweeting, please use the hashtag FPBigBets so as to participate in the conversation. David, thanks very much.
Thank you, Martin. That was a great setup, I thought, to the discussion, to get some sort of background to the daunting challenges that the president faces, both the opportunities and then what could be crises that he has to respond to. I will reiterate what Martin just said, that if you are tweeting, use the hashtag FPBigBets, FP for foreign policy, big bets. I'll remind you of that as we go along. Let me tell you my approach to this. It's as if I'm the president's chief of staff here, and I've got policy folks who are making their policy prescriptions in the form of these memos. I'm going to draw them out very briefly on what the point is of their particular topic, and then we'll have some discussion, as you would on a national security team in the White House, about what ultimately should reach the president's desk and what should become an actual priority for the president, because, as we know, we're having a conversation about foreign policy, and we know that the current focus of Washington is anything but. While there's some focus on Afghanistan and withdrawal, domestic matters, primarily fiscal matters, will dominate. The gun control debate is about to dominate Washington, and all of the politics attendant to those issues. So it's a crowded attention span that the president already has. So with that, Bob Kagan, you write about a plastic moment, which is an opportunity for the president to reshape the world order, and you say the biggest of those bets is preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, something that's been hanging over his administration and, of course, the Bush administration before him.
Well, yeah, but I mean, my biggest pitch, first of all, if I can say, by the way, congratulations on your new job.
Chief of Staff, yeah, thank you very much. Yes.
I know it wasn't the job you wanted, but these things do happen this way. The pitch I have to make to the president, and hope you will, and thank you for the 15 minutes to discuss foreign policy, is that he needs to take foreign policy very seriously in his second term. I would make partly this is about his legacy, and it's a little bit about politics. I mean, he didn't really pay as much attention to foreign policy in the first term as he might have. The press has sort of given him a free pass on that up until now, but I'm beginning to think that with some of the issues that are cropping up, the return of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups in North Africa, that foreign policy could become a big issue again, and he doesn't want to look like he's not doing anything. Now, as it happens, he really does have opportunities in the international environment. We have a situation where the liberal order is fraying at the edges. Major institutions like the EU, the UN, and others are not as effective as they could be. And there's a perception that America is sort of absent from the field. I think if he brings the United States back in and takes some of the initiatives that we're going to be talking about here, whether it's on the trade front, on dealing with Asia, and of course Iran is going to be a critical component of the success of this liberal order, he really does have an opportunity to shape things now. When Martin and I talk about a plastic moment, we're quoting someone who talked about a plastic moment after World War I, when it seemed the United States really could step in and shape the international system. Well, as it happens, the United States sort of backed away from that challenge then to great cost. I think we are at one of those moments again. The world is in turmoil, which means it can be shaped, and the U.S. really does have the capacity to do it.
That's such an interesting point, because aren't we at a similar point in history where the first term of President Obama has been about the return from foreign engagement and foreign wars, and necessarily more of a domestic focus? Isn't that precisely where we are now? And even warfare itself is becoming a narrower enterprise under President Obama.
No, absolutely. And you know, if you look historically, the United States has gone through this kind of pattern before. This was the mood in the 1920s. Tremendous disillusionment after World War I, a desire to bring everybody home. I think we learned the lesson of that, and it really is the job of the president not to simply respond to this mood in the country, but to push back on it, to re-educate Americans on the importance of that role, and himself. And a president in the second term has the capacity to take initiatives that can begin to restore a sense of American leadership and American competence in the international system.
I guess the question for everybody, for the rest of us, as we take on this idea of Bob's, it's not a question of should, but does the president want to do this? Does he want to take on the kind of tasks that are as entrepreneurial as opposed to just being reactive? What do you say? Start, Suzanne.
Well, let me just say I think that Iran is both an opportunity, as Bob has laid out, but it's also, of course, a threat, because as the video we saw preceding this discussion suggested, that if something is not done in a relatively short time span, we are going to be faced with the decision of either accepting an Iranian nuclear weapon or launching military strikes to prevent just that. But we're at this kind of sweet spot right now, and I know that the president might be a little hesitant to go back to the engagement that he originally advocated in his first term, given how little dividends he saw from the engagement and how well he did in terms of assembling a really robust sanctions regime. But now is the moment to test the Iranians. Now is the moment when the sanctions have created an enormous price on the Iranian economy. It's a moment in which the political debate within Iran is actually fortuitous. Surprisingly, this is almost never the case. We have a very clear set of decision makers, and we actually have pressure, pushback on the Iranian supreme leader.
And I want to come back to, that's the subject of your memo, and we'll come back to that. But I want to just challenge Bob to this extent. What are the limits of U.S. influence now, despite your prescription that we ought to use as much influence as we have? I think of the Arab Spring, I think about Iran as just two examples where the influence may be in doubt.
Well, American influence is never unlimited. We're always constrained. Foreign policy is a difficult thing to do well, and we rarely do it well. Sometimes we get it right. I do feel like we've overlearned the lesson of Iraq and Afghanistan. We went in probably overconfident about what we could accomplish with military force or even with our other capacities. We've now gotten to the point where we don't think we can do anything. And I think we need to recover from that. And we need to recover from it pretty quickly. And I think we need, it is a question, though, of course, of whether the president really wants to devote his time to and energy to trying to shape the international environment. One thing we know for sure, whether he wants to do foreign policy is going to come at him. On Iran, on Syria, on a number of other issues. And I think, look, let's face it, for the past year in the election season, you and your colleagues have put a lockdown on foreign policy. You're going to have to get away from that now. This is going to be a critical year, and the next couple of years are going to be critical. And you really do need to fight back against this tendency to be inward-looking.
Mm-hmm. I want to push back just a little bit on overlearning the lessons of Iraq and Iran or Afghanistan. I focus mostly on Asia, and on Asia the dynamic's somewhat different. Probably the biggest strategic bet the president placed in his first 4 years was rebalancing from the Middle East Asia. It's a bet both on our capacity to draw down somewhat our resources in the Middle East, but especially to engage Asia across diplomatic, economic, and security realms in order over the long run to benefit from Asia's dynamic economic growth without putting at risk huge amounts of American treasure and potentially American lives as security issues there develop. If you look at what's happened since that pivot or rebalancing was announced 2 years ago now, we've been drawing increasingly into the security side of the equation, not so much on the economic side. Countries in the region have been encouraging us to show up on the security side out of concerns over China. But at the end of the day, that will leave China using Asia as its biggest profit center, investment and trade just booming, and us picking up the tab for the security side so that our friends and allies can trade and invest with China. We can't afford that, and it's not where we want to end up. So I think that the president early on now has to rebalance his rebalancing strategy in order to bring China in a more positive fashion. And there are things we can do with the Chinese to at least increase our sense of mutual confidence.
So
right?
what does that look like, though, in practice, to bring them in?
Look, first of all, we have to take the initiative. The Chinese leaders don't do that on new approaches. Secondly, we have a new leadership in China, so now's the time to take the initiative. I think the president can propose a whole series of efforts that he can make that do not require the Congress, that are within his power, on issues of consequence to China. This includes having a truly political military dialogue about strategic postures in the region. Can include committing to wrap up finally our 3.5-year-long technology export review policy, which the Chinese, among many others, have been waiting to see the results of. There are a whole series of things we can do. We should quietly communicate that package to the Chinese. You can put together a very impressive list. By the way, it's in the briefing book if anyone wants to look it up. And ask the Chinese on their side to put together their own counter package, something that is of equal value to us. And then we can negotiate to see what we want to get done. If those two packages are sufficiently enticing to both sides, we can then take steps to
But move the focus
them.
away from primarily military. Charles.
Absolutely.
David, I think that the administration's missing another critical point, particularly as we look at our strategic posture in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East. And that is, within a decade, North America is not going to need any oil from the Persian Gulf. The people that are going to need the oil are China, India, Japan, and the other leading states of Asia. This is going to lead to, I think, a fundamental question. Are we prepared to waste our national treasure and the lives of our sons and daughters for an area of the world where others have the strategic interests, not ourselves? Now, obviously, we have other interests in the Gulf, support of Israel and terrorism, but I think it does represent a fundamental change. And if I were an Asian foreign policy maker, I would sit back and say, maybe we need to rethink our own defense and commercial policy relations with the Gulf states, because we are the ones who are going to need their oil, not the United States.
Is there any indication that they think along those lines, Ken?
They're beginning to get drawn into the concern. And especially, frankly, the Chinese, who realize they know very little about this region, are rapidly becoming more dependent on it, and are worried about, I've taught them a new term in recent discussions there, which is the term tar baby. And the Middle East is a tar baby, and they have just wound up and taken their first punch at it with their investments there. And they're going to get drawn in, and they need to learn a lot. And frankly, they need to cooperate with us, the Indians and the Japanese, much more if they're going to realize their goals there.
What are the consequences? You talk more about it, Charles, but Bob, the consequences of, or at least the prospect, the opportunity of more energy independence on the part of the United States in terms of how much attention we paid to the Middle East, trying to use influence, trying to shape outcomes, as opposed to just looking away.
Well, I disagree with my colleague in the sense that I think it's an illusion to imagine that just because we are not dependent on oil in the Middle East, that the Middle East doesn't remain a vital strategic concern of ours. The fact is, it's not just the Asians who need that oil, it's going to be our European allies as well. And after all, the price of oil is affected by what happens, and therefore our economy is directly affected by whether there's security in the region or not. I mean, my view is that this whole idea of rebalancing or pivoting has been, I'm all in favor of more attention to East Asia, but it actually can't be at the expense of a region which is going to be volatile, from which clearly there are terrorist threats and are going to be, where we have a close ally. And I think that we have to, in fact, rebalance in a way of understanding that there were three critical regions of the world that the United States has historically provided security for, and I think needs to continue to do so, or security in cooperation with. One is Asia, one is Europe, and one is the Middle East. That's what it means to be a superpower. That's what it means to play the role the United States has played in the world.
Let me get Mireya in here as well, so everybody's got some of their prescriptions on the table here, because you're looking at economic security that's possible with additional free trade agreements, as you write about in your memo. And yet again, that pushes up against the reality of looking at our own polling at NBC that's coming out tonight, which is fear and anxiety over the economy, and that being a top priority for voters, whether you're going to have more jobs created, expansion of our economy. It seems like opening up our markets is going to scare a lot of people.
It will indeed, and I think that the president has a hard battle against, he has to fight this battle and he has to win the public opinion and convince them of the benefits of free trade. Clearly in a recessionary climate, people become more skeptical, but I think that the opportunities are really golden when you think about the fact that, you know, the Doha round continues to stagnate. We need to readjust the aims of trade policy towards things that can be negotiated, and there are two major trans-regional agreements in the horizon, one with Asia Pacific and one with Europe. And I think that we have to make the case that a free trade will bring prosperity, that we need a firm anchor in the world's most dynamic region in the world, that there is a lot of compatibility and convergence with the European Union, that we can work together in drafting new standards and rules for trade and investment, and that we should not turn inwards. I think that that's the worst thing we could do. And I think that the rebalancing, a lot of how it has been discussed in Asia, has to do with the security angle. Well, there's an opportunity to make it a more of a win-win proposition by showing that, in fact, both parties can benefit from constructive competition. Clearly, there will be different blueprints as to how East Asia should integrate economically. There are two on the table. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Initiative, which is the U.S. Vision of where this should go, and then the one that ASEAN and China are promoting, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. But this is not a zero-sum competition. This is not like security alliances where you have to be on one camp or the other. In fact, there are actually many countries that participate in both, and that they see a benefit in moving forward in trying to open markets and not close them in a recessionary climate.
Charles, can you jump back into Bob's point too? You know, the economic opportunities that we're talking about through free trade, but also energy independence, and does that cause the United States to, you know, shift its gaze from a vital part of the world? Expand on what you think is possible and whether you disagree with Bob.
Well, part of this is outlined in Kevin Massey's and my memo, but I think we need to completely rethink our trade policy and energy. We now have a situation with our unconventional gas reserves, our oil production once again going back up, a leading coal producer in the world, to be the supplier to meet the needs of the rest of the world. We can kid ourselves till we're blue in the face that somehow coal and fossil fuels are going away. But if we look at every projection by the International Energy Agency, leading oil companies, fossil fuel consumption is going to rise dramatically, and principally in Asia, over the next 20 years. Now the question is, do we want to serve that market and get the benefits from free trade that our dynamic resources give us, high-paying jobs, or do we want the Australians in the case of LNG, or the Russians in the case of gas, to get the predominant economic rent here? I think it's time to rethink that we should become the leading energy exporter of the world, but with the caveat, as we highlight in our memo, so we don't just sound like we're forgetting about the environment, that we put a strong tax on the production of these fossil fuels that then goes into research on the two most vital energy future questions for the world, I would argue, which are first, proving that carbon capture and sequestration of both coal and gas is both technically and commercially viable, because the rest of the world is going to continue to use these fuels, and also advanced battery storage technology. Because once we show that large-scale battery technology can occur, then we have solar and wind going into our baseload electric power systems. We could then be the leaders in both these technologies, CCS and battery storage, selling it around the world and truly making a positive contribution to climate change, not the rhetoric we get from extending production tax credits for offshore windmills, which make no economic sense, and other piecemeal legislation.
Suzanne, let me get you back in here talking about Iran, because you make reference to it. But as a policy prescription for the second term, it is a little bit brave, I guess, at this juncture to say, no, go back at them again and try to negotiate with the Iranians when it didn't work.
Well, the context is so different today than it was 4 years ago. And I think that's why President Obama really does need to go back to this idea of going long and big on Iran, which is to say there is a deal out there, in part because of the sanctions, in part because of the shifts in the domestic political climate within Iran, but also because we now have this incredible international coalition. I think it gets to the question of whether there really is a strategic binary choice between a shift and a pivot to Asia and a focus on the Middle East. I don't think there in fact is. I think that in fact, energy independence will enable us to bring in more partners, to force and persuade key players like China to take a more aggressive stance on a country like Iran and on a challenge like Iran. We know that the Iranians are prepared to make a deal on the issue of their 20% enrichment. This is kind of low-hanging fruit. It's been out there for at least 18 months. And I think, if anything, a campaign year probably persuaded the administration to slow roll it. Now is the time to get that deal. I'm not convinced, and I lay this out in the memo, that that is necessarily or quickly going to lead us to the big strategic bargain with Iran. But I do think that there is a new climate for negotiations that the president has to take advantage of, that he has to do more to bring in and to actually empower the Chinese, who have in fact played a very productive role over the past 4 years on Iran.
Why should Iran be trusted, Bob? This notion that there's a deal to be had with Iran.
Well, I'm not sure that's my analysis, but I could certainly say that, one element, they certainly are under a lot of pressure. There is going to be a lot of pressure moving forward. And, I think, as I understand our recommendation, there is an alternative to negotiation, which ought to be very unattractive to them. And I think, actually, it's very important that the president be extremely credible, both as someone who is prepared to make a deal if there's a good deal to be made, but also to fulfill his own stated position that he's not going to allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon one way or another. I think that it's important to have both elements of that giving us the best chance that I think there is. Whether you're overly optimistic or or pessimistic, I think clearly you have to give it a real chance, but you do have to have both elements of that equation in place.
Who has a view on how the administration goes about setting some of these priorities? It's not to say that you can't walk and chew gum at the same time, but with tremendous domestic inbox that's already full, how do you propose prioritizing some of these prescriptions?
Obviously, our relationship with China should come first. It's so obvious it doesn't need explanation.
Exactly.
Right? No, seriously, as you look to the future, we're dealing with a country here that has the world's second largest GDP, may well have the world's largest GDP within a decade or so, while the world's most rapidly growing military is in the center of the most dynamic region of the world. So both sides have said for some time, this is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. I think both sides are right. So we have to do what we can to get this on a reasonably positive track. I think most specialists would say in the last year and a half, it actually has gone in the wrong direction. On balance, distrust of each other has grown. So there's no magic formula to this, but we do have a new leadership in China. It's a remarkable change of leadership. 70% of the top stratum of their government, their party, and their military have turned over, or the government is in the next 2 months or so. But within a short period of time, it's a massive turnover. It's the right time to take some initiatives to build bridges and try to get this moving in a more constructive fashion so they do not see us as determined to either complicate or disrupt their legitimate aspirations to rise to major power status.
Can the new leadership be more helpful on Iran than it's been up until now?
Yes, I think it can. I think the keys to that are twofold. One is what I just mentioned, having a somewhat greater sense of confidence in each other's motivations. But the other is the Chinese are much more supportive when we go through the UN than they are when we impose unilateral sanctions and tell everyone else that they have to sign on to them. So to the extent that we can channel this through the UN, I think we'll get much more encouragement from China and discipline in following the resulting resolutions.
If I could just interject here, but Ken, how at the same time, and I agree with you, China is obviously the key cornerstone of our relationship, how do we assure our friends in Japan, Korea, India, that the Chinese bellicosity on things like control of the South China Sea, where in the case of the Northeast Asian states, all their energy, coal, gas, and oil, come through that, how do we assure them that this is not a threat to their long-term strategic interests, and that indeed, if it is a threat, that we're there to support them in some way without obviously going to war with China.
Well, I think in two ways. One is we simply provide assurance. You know, we talk with them all the time. We do a lot of actions in the region. PACOM is extremely active around Asia, our Pacific Command and joint exercises and that kind of thing. So we just provide straight reassurance. But the second thing is, and this is very widespread sentiment throughout the region, that no country in the region wants to have to choose between the United States and China. That's a disaster. While 5 years ago or 4 years ago, there was some worry that there might be a kind of G2, the U.S. and China will get together and try to dictate to the rest of the region. No one's worried about that anymore either. So the question is, can we handle the Chinese issue wisely, is the term you always hear around the region. In other words, can we manage it so that we minimize conflict and help to shape Chinese incentives so that they are not as bellicose on some of these issues? And there are no guarantees, but I think there is a strategy, I've tried to lay it out in the memo, that at least increases the chances of getting there.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Can I just take on this whole bandwidth question a little bit? I find there's a little bit of a, everybody makes the point, so I'm not directing this at you, but I think we've gotten awfully complacent about the idea that there's just so much bandwidth. You know, for decades, American presidents and foreign policy establishments and Secretary of State have dealt with simultaneously East Asia, the Middle East, Europe, sometimes even during recessions. There is enough bandwidth if the president wants to be active. All of these priorities, you could talk about how important China is, but Iran is going to be a crisis this year, whether we pay attention to China or not.
But isn't that the challenge to your point, Bob? It's not that you don't have staffs. You have a big administration that can work these portfolios. But the level of attention that a president can dedicate usually becomes reactive and not proactive. See Bin Laden, Osama for a decade prior to 9/11.
No. If you want to go through the history of failed American foreign policies, we can do that. However, and there have been things that are missed. But the idea that we can't do 4 or 5 major policy initiatives in the world at the same time as we're dealing with economic problems, I think is ridiculous. Now, it's also the case, and I think people who watch this know this is true, that certainly for the last couple of years, the White House has kept policy making very tightly within a small group of people in the White House. Well, the smaller the group of people you have operating, the less bandwidth you have. The president necessarily has to do both. You have to give your cabinet officers a little more leeway to go out there and make policy.
That's a very interesting point, and I'd like for anybody can take a whack at this, but I am curious as we look at the legacy of Secretary Clinton, if that is in fact symptomatic of what you're talking about, which is a huge public profile internationally, well regarded throughout the globe, but has her policy portfolio been constricted by the fact that it's so White House centric?
I want to get back first to Bob's point about bandwidth, and I'll get to the
because you have the bandwidth
later.
To answer both.
No, well,
yes.
Mostly because I think that we are unnecessarily compartmentalizing these issues. That everything that we've talked about in our memos, and frankly, almost all the foreign policy issues, if not all of them, that are discussed in this book, have direct implications on the economy. That is, obviously, energy independence can be channeled in a way that will in fact help the domestic economy. Whether or not we go to a war with Iran will have an enormous implication on the prospects for not simply our own economy, but the global recovery. So everything that we're talking about in terms of leadership and presidential prioritization, it has direct implications and positive implications for all of his domestic agenda.
On the capacity to do more than one thing at a time, sure. But on the military side, we're increasingly limited. I mean, the politics of the military are how do you cut the budget, and how do you constrain obligations.
Well, you're not offering us a military solution to the China problem, so
no, I'm not. But I would argue that we are getting drawn into increasing military commitments in East Asia, and part of the way to limit that is to do better on the China problem. So it is connected. And I do think, as the president thinks about foreign policy issues, the military implications of each issue loom very large for him.
Can I just get back to your Secretary Clinton question?
Yeah.
Because like so many people, I think everyone has to admire what she has managed to do in that post. But I do think that the change in leadership at state presents an opportunity, particularly on the Iran question, and I think it would be laudable, if not potentially very effective to see a Secretary Kerry come in and really take the negotiations portfolio under his own wing very directly in a way that Secretary Clinton and even her predecessors did not. Ultimately, it is the Secretary of State who has responsibility for diplomatic negotiations, and this is the most important negotiation that this administration
Well,
will
Mireya,
see.
I mean, you talk about free trade, for instance. I mean, is there the capacity, at least, for a new Secretary of State to advance some of these issues in the portfolio without the president's complete attention?
Oh, there is. And I think that's the point I want to make. The payoffs are huge, right? We're talking about economic growth, prosperity, open markets. And we're actually talking about investments that are not so high to realize those goals. Why I say that? Well, because one of these unprecedented trade agreements, a Trans-Pacific Partnership, has been under negotiation for more than 2 years. We're now on the closing line. Clearly, there will need to be, political nurturing of this to make sure that the deals are cut. But this is very doable, and this is not going to consume much attention from the president or the secretary can do this. You have a very capable USTR trade hands that have been carrying these negotiations. It can be done. And the negotiations with Europe should not be too difficult in the sense, again, that there is a basic convergence on what rules we want for trade and investment. There will be difficult issues along the way. These are trade deals that will take time to negotiate, but not so long and not in a way in which they tax the rest of the priorities for the second term.
The constraints are not capabilities, the constraints are will. And most of the time, if the White House was locking down foreign policy, it's because they didn't want political bombs going off on various issues. They wanted to control the political narrative. And that's understandable. Every White House does. But that has created low bandwidth. And once the president says, by the way, the president did not begin the negotiation of a new trade agreement during his first 4 years. He finished the job of 3 other negotiations. There's no reason in the world why he shouldn't be able to begin a new trade negotiation for a U.S.-EU. And all he has to do is say, I'm going for it. Now you go take care of it. He doesn't have to be doing it himself. But the problem is they've been in political lockdown for so long.
Suzanne, it raises the question, as the video did, I thought, in an introductory sense, the specter of Islamist regimes in the Middle East as a result of the Arab Spring. And you take the example of Egypt and Morsi with his latest tirade that's been unearthed. And it makes you wonder what sort of potential partner this is for the United States and for this administration at this particular moment. And how and to what extent we get involved to shape events to avoid that outcome.
Morsi's a problematic partner, but he's a partner, and that wasn't necessarily assured when we watched events unfold in Tahrir Square. And I think the fact that we've seen him come through on key issues at key moments in a way that has been, in fact, supportive of the overall U.S.-Egyptian relationship and, of course, of the enduring peace agreements is one that is vital. Now, I know in your next session you're going to get into some of the potential black swans that may, in fact, create new crises. And I think it's entirely probable that this administration in its second term is going to face unpredictable and very dangerous and threatening events across the span of the Middle East. But again, it argues for seizing the opportunities that might exist today while the moment is there.
And Bob, you wouldn't disagree with the idea that the black swans, the 9/11s, the Arab Springs, they do change the trajectory of an administration, and they do alter the ability to be proactive and to shape in the way that you're prescribing. I mean, no doubt 9/11 created some opportunities that the Bush administration saw to try to reshape the Middle East. They endeavored to do some of that, but really ended up getting locked into Iraq even more than Afghanistan.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right that these events reshape administrations. After all, George W. Bush came in hoping to retrench a little bit the American role in the world, and that's not the way it happened. Now, on the other hand, they also have a way of affecting American public opinion. So some crises that may erupt, some of these black swans may in fact have the effect of reminding Americans what an important job there is to be done overseas. You know, right now there's sort of this sense that nothing bad can happen and we really need to focus on domestic problems exclusively. But I think the world is going to remind Americans that that's not really true. And even what we're seeing, you know, in Mali and Algeria today, and that's just a small black swan, if you will. It may get bigger. I think that events are not only going to shape what the president thinks, but they're also going to shape American public attitudes, which may give the president more ability to take action.
I want to get to your questions in just a minute. One question that always comes up in my mind, is there an overarching Obama doctrine in terms of precisely the role that the United States ought to play in the world? Does anybody think there is one, or should there be one that you can help him define?
There is I won't call it a doctrine, but there's an approach that you could call progressive pragmatism, basically looking for liberal international order, but adjusting as necessary to the realities of the circumstances that he
You said looking for what international?
Liberal international order,
yeah.
but adjusting to realities on the ground. So he's not an ideological guy, but he is someone who sets some goals and then tries to figure out how to get from here to there. And I would agree, at times just pulls back more than one would wish. But to me, that's kind of where he is. I don't think he's going to change on that in a second term.
But at the risk of sounding parochial, coming back to energy, you know,
because this is the area he probably will dive in the biggest.
I fear the wrong way, but he probably will. But coming to energy in the Middle East, you know, obviously Iran's nuclear things, the Arab Spring are sexy issues. But, you know, energy is a major constraint on the ability of these societies to get kick-started. We've had riots in Jordan that have threatened the king over the rise in petroleum prices. Similarly in Egypt. Pakistan, you know, with all our problems with Iran, if we want Pakistan's economy to be stabilized, it needs energy. The country has blackouts and brownouts in their cities 20 hours a day. Industrial textile production collapses, throwing industries into turmoil. Iranian natural gas, which Pakistan desperately needs, sits right across the border. There's been talk about a pipeline for years now. Yes, I know we don't want to do anything with Iran right now, but does it really make sense, economic sense, to continue to go against the project that could bolster the economy of a country we desperately want to have survive? I mean, these are dichotomies, and I think too often we get our strategic and foreign policy away from our economic policies that make sense. And in this case, I think the administration is wrong. We need that gas in Pakistan if we have any hope of bolstering that economy.
Let me get a couple of questions from here. Yes. The microphones are coming.
Thank you. Benjamin Tua, retired Foreign Service officer. My question is to Suzanne Maloney, and it concerns what strikes me as a rather narrow focus exclusively on the nuclear issue without looking at the motivations and concerns, fears of the Iranians that lead to the program. Secondly, what kind of broader agreement would be mutually acceptable to the U.S. and Iran concerning their respective roles in the region? And thirdly, the potentially positive role of better relations between Iran and other Gulf states, primarily Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
That is a tall order. I will try to run through a couple of points real quickly. I don't dismiss Iran's motivations and fundamental insecurity, although I do think that increasingly over time that insecurity is no longer so much a product of its historical experiences and particularly the invasion, but a product of the narrowness of the base of the regime and its lack of legitimacy with its own people, which has become obviously a greater problem during the course of the first term of the Obama administration. I do think a broader deal would be ideal, and I think that there's a deal out there that is mutually tolerable, one that in fact would permit Iran to retain several thousand centrifuges running under enormous international scrutiny and constraint. You've seen endorsement of just such a deal in recent days from an array of former Iranian MPs who are now, of course, in exile as a result of the turmoil that took place in Iran in 2009. I think that the Iranians could live with this kind of a deal, something that endorses their right to enrich, but in fact gives the international community far greater transparency and certainty that we will know if and when Iran does make the dash for a bomb. Finally, in terms of a better relationship between Iran and the United States, I am a long-standing supporter, of the Gulf states. I'm a supporter of engagement. I believe that, in fact, the diplomacy that exists in the Gulf is always more complicated, more nuanced, and more pragmatic than we ever give it credit for, and than any of our diplomatic partners in the Gulf typically articulate to us. But ultimately, there is an ongoing and deepening divide between the North and Southern Gulf as a result of what's happening in Syria, and that is an enormous concern, something we haven't talked a great deal about here today. But I think it's something that the Obama administration is going to have to spend some time on, this issue of sectarian differences and the deep and abiding mistrust between Sunni Arabs and Shia, both Arabs and Persians, is one that has enormous implications and possibilities for conflict across the region.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Richard Burt, McClarty Associates. I want to stay on Iran for a second. I agree very much with your conclusion that we should seek some kind of deal with Iran. But I think your distinction between either getting a deal or using military force is a false choice. What about deterrence? I know that President Obama has rejected containment, but containment is different. In fact, I think we're pursuing a containment strategy right now against Iran. But deterrence is different. And we successfully deterred the Soviet Union, who was a nuclear power, for many decades. Even when people said, well, the Russians or Stalin wouldn't be deterred. We deterred the Chinese when people said Mao wouldn't be deterred. Why couldn't we offer a nuclear umbrella to the Gulf states as well as to Israel and make the necessary adjustments to our nuclear posture to make sure it was credible?
I agree with you entirely, and in fact, I did not mean to suggest that there was a binary choice here between a bomb and bombing. Although I believe that there are others on this panel who would take a different posture, and I want to make sure that they have an opportunity to jump in. I just wanted to say, in fact, what I'm proposing is not the grand bargain tomorrow, but that in what we can do and what we can achieve is a relatively modest deal. It's out there. The Iranians want it. We would be very happy to have it because it would resolve one of the most urgent items of concern with respect to the Iranian nuclear program, and that is this 20% enrichment. If we can find a way to stop it, it buys us some time. It does not solve the problem. It does not bring us any closer to a rapprochement with Iran. We have to, in fact, pay something to get it. We're going to have to put some sanctions relaxation or suspension on the table in order to get that deal, and that's problematic and politically complicated. But we should do it because, in fact, it buys us time, and while we have that time, we can continue, as we have very successfully over the past 34 years, to deter Iran. But I suspect there are others who see the choice as a bit more stark and potentially more urgent.
I mean, I was just repeating what I saw on the summary of your memo. But as far as that our introductory piece was concerned, you know, I think that there is very reasonable. There's a reason to be concerned that a consequence of Iran getting a nuclear weapon is that other nations in the region will want to get nuclear weapons too. And I'm not sure that we will be quite as credible as we might need to be to prevent them from doing that. Because having, by the way, said that we're not going to allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon and then allowing them to get a nuclear weapon, anyone who has traveled in the region knows that they don't trust us as far as they can throw us anyway, if only because of things that have happened in Egypt and elsewhere. If you add to that we have now failed in our stated objective in preventing Iran to get a nuclear weapon, the notion that we can just say to them, don't worry, we got you covered, I think is questionable, at least, in which case you might have a situation in fairly short order. I don't know how long it would take the Saudis to get their bomb from Pakistan if they wanted to, or other nations in the region to have nuclear weapons. And then I think we're living in a very different kind of world. And I don't look with nostalgia back on the Cold War as many seem to do. I seem to recall there were some pretty hairy moments during the Cold War. You know, I don't want to go back to the Eisenhower days, even though Evan Thomas advises us it would be wonderful to be threatening to nuke people all the time as a key part of our foreign policy. I would prefer to avoid that if possible. And so, on balance, I think that, you know, the world of Iran and several other countries in that region having a nuclear weapon is not a world that I think we should take lightly, and I think it is worth the downsides, of which there are significant downsides, of preventing that. But ideally, working it out peacefully. That is certainly the most important objective.
Let me do one more question here, okay? Sir. Yeah, okay.
Thanks very much. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report. And I was thinking one of the ways we could characterize this discussion thus far is to say it's really been a sort of a debate about whether we can chew gum and walk at the same time. And I want to offer another metaphor, which is, it seems to me that increasingly we're talking about whether we can chew gum and floss at the same time. That things have gotten a little tougher. And as I think about the scope of this conversation itself, it's very America-centric and it's very foreign policy-centric by definition, which means that there are at least three factors that I can think of we're leaving out. One is America's domestic political stalemating, which has a huge impact on our bandwidth. The second is the sort of diffusion of power around the globe. And the third would be global economic instability. So my question to the panel is whether we have given, whether in this segment or in the Black Swan segment, we have given or can given more attention to those ostensibly non-American and or non-foreign policy related factors that could well derail our best intentions.
Go ahead.
In a sense, oh, I'm sorry.
Mireya, go ahead.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, trade politics and domestic politics are joined at the hip, right? They're inseparable. And very much the credibility that the United States has when it sits in a negotiation table has to do with what is the domestic consensus or lack thereof, and to what extent there is dysfunction in Congress. So you can see that it does hurt very much the credibility of the United States. And one of the things that we wrote in the memo is that we need a public awareness campaign so that these public opinion polls that show erosion of support for free trade can be stalled and hopefully reversed. But we also need to start very much the effort to get Congress to secure trade promotion authority. And the fact is that the American record on trade promotion authority is not good lately because simply it has not been renewed, because agreements that were negotiated under that trade promotion authority later on, they were not really, they were amended, they were not ratified on time and so forth. So clearly what the United States can do in the trade front is very much influenced by how the President Obama is going to deal with Congress and how is he going to bring on board. We need society buy-in if any of this is going to gain traction.
If I could pick up on that, when Senator Wyden is going to be head of the Senate Energy Committee, adamantly opposed to new coal export facilities in the Northwest. Or you get Dow Chemical and other leading manufacturers opposed to natural gas exports abroad when it makes all the economic sense in the world. So everything we try to do in energy is, including in our export policy on energy, is directly related to domestic political opposition from one corner or another.
If I could just add an additional footnote, I think many of us have argued in other venues very strongly that probably the single most important factor determining the success of America's foreign policy over the next 4 years is going to be whether we get control of our fiscal problems and get some sort of politically viable agreement to bend the curve on revenues and expenditures going forward. So 10 years from now, we're not so deeply in debt that the debt seriously diminishes our global capacities. Let me add, finally, the Black Swan panel coming up is really focused on what's going to happen out there that we don't control that can really come back to bite us. So I think that this overall volume does get to your third point, and you'll see some evidence of that coming right up.
And I think it's an appropriate place to end, because I think what I take from this discussion is really the set of options that the president has, absent a low probability, high impact event sort of taking over his administration. How does he take charge of a second term and seek to address some of these areas where he can have maximum impact in a second term? And so those are the choices that are before him and the country. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.